Welcome back to another episode of How It Works. My name is Ken Baker from Green Pro Solutions, and today we're going to be talking about rebuilding pumps. This particular pump is a Delta 75. The process that we're going to do with the Delta 75 is very similar to the Zeta and the other one similar to that. So this particular one, we're going to show how to do a basic maintenance. There's different levels of maintenance on these pumps. This one is an annual or every 500 hours. We highly recommend every season that you take the time to do this. The process probably will take a matter of an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on how skill set you are. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down and showing how to change the diaphragms, the 3 diaphragms, and the baskets that are within them. But first, before we do that, we need to drain the oil. So what we do, so before we even do that, the tools that you're going to need are very, very important. This is all metric, so you're going to need a 13 millimeter socket. You're going to need a 17 meter socket, and you're going to need a 7/8 standard socket. You're going to need a rubber mallet, and you're going to need a torque wrench. And some of the other things you'll need is some kind of a grease that's non-petroleum based. Very important. They have different types of grease out here. That's a lubriplast. You can get it from ARAG, but you don't want an oil-based product because the oil-based products will swell your O-rings, and it will break down the longevity of them. We also need is your oil. This is a Udor lube oil, specifically made for their pumps, but basically any pump that's 40 weight oil would work. You also have your gear oil, which is also a 90 weight. And we particularly use this brand, but you can use any brand that has that same kind of weight. So what we need to do first is drain the fluid from this as part of the maintenance. So what we do is we turn it upside down, and if you see here, there is a brass nut on the bottom. What you need to do is loosen that up. I recommend loosening it up and then taking it, don't take it all the way off, and then take your drain pan, put it like a drain pan underneath, undo your nut, and let it sit for a few minutes until all the oil comes out. Now there should be about 32 ounces, and that's what this pump holds in pump oil. So let it drain out for a few minutes, and then what you do is just put the nut back in and tighten it. Now this is on the top here, this green container here is called your oil reservoir. This is how you fill it, and we'll go into that towards the end. But as you're draining it, you should probably take off your cap because it will help allow it to drain more efficiently. Now there is O-rings in here you want to be careful of. There's an O-ring in the bottom here you want to be careful of. That probably would need to be changed annually or biannually, but just making sure they're properly seated and you should be fine. So again, leave this off while it's draining so all the fluid can come back out. Once it's done, then you can position the pump, and we're going to start to drain the fluid from here. Now this technically does not have to be done when you're doing this. It's just a good habit of changing your gear oil at the same time you're doing your pump oil. Now this takes again, all-purpose gear oil, and the way to drain that is, again, there's a drain plug on the very bottom. You loosen that out, take that off, drain it into a pan, and that should take a few minutes itself. That takes about 16 ounces of the fluid. And again, there's a top nut here to fill. You loosen that, take that off, and let it drain out. And it probably takes 10 to 15 minutes for all that to completely drain out. Put your brass nut back on, leave that open. And we'll get to filling it when we're done here. This particular pump has, as you'll see, 1, 2, 3, 4. It has 4 heads. One of these heads is, when you go to remove it, it's going to look different than the others, and there's a reason for that. This head here has a cup, which it's a diaphragm. This is not the same thing that goes on the other 3. This is a diaphragm that helps allow the motor to run smoothly. It's very easy to replace. You basically remove it, take the head off here with your appropriate socket, take your diaphragm out, take your new one. And I recommend using the lubricant, non-petroleum preferably. You take a little bit of the petroleum and you rub it on the outside edge. It just helps it keep a nice seal. And you place it, you want to make sure this seat here is all nice and clean. There's no product or anything in there. You basically seat that in there and you're good to go. And you take your top, place it back on, make sure the other side has a very good seat. Place that back on. Now you don't necessarily have to have all the bolts in, it was just that way to hold them, but go ahead and put your bolts in. Now there's one last step that we need to do when it's all done, and it's this little Schrader valve here, which I'll talk about. You remove it, it's almost like a Schrader on your bike tire. Now you want to fill this up 20% of the maximum pressure of this pump. So if you look at your name tag, the max pressure of this pump is 580. So you're looking at 120 psi, typically the most of your compressors can put out. So you need to take your compressor, put it on the end of here, and apply about 120 psi of pressure. And again, it's just like your tire in your car or your bike or your car. And then you would put it back on. But you'd have to wait until the very end to do the other heads before you do. This should be the very last thing you do. But I'll remind you at the end to do that. Now once you get that head back on, then you can loosen and take these off. Now I do recommend, you can use an impact. Unless you're experienced, I'd rather not. You can use a ratchet, with your socket, put it on and take it off. The reason I don't recommend that if you're not experienced is because you could strip the threads out in these very easily. And if you hold it just too long, putting it in or taking it out, you will strip the heads in these. They are repairable, but it's very expensive to repair. So for the first few times, I would recommend just getting, in this case, this is a torque wrench, putting your socket on there and taking your bolts off and taking the rest by hand. When you get more experience and feel very comfortable, you can use the socket wrench and take it off. It's a lot faster. But again, I recommend not if it's your first time. So you loosen your bolts, you take your head off, and what you see here are a diaphragm. It's usually white, green, I may even be purple. Now here you see some O-rings, and here you see some O-rings. And then we're going to take off the very end. Which you're going to see a basket there, which comes out. And then you see one here that comes out. Now these may look complicated, but these can go in only one way. So we're going to focus on this for a moment. So right now, as you see all that dirty residue in there, that's just product. Before you put the O-rings back in, see those O-rings in there? You want to make sure all that residue is cleaned out. Make sure there's a good seat in there. Take a 4-0 steel wool and just clean that up a little bit. Don't need to press hard. Clean that up nicely. Then you take your replacement O-ring that goes back in there, you take a little bit of the gel or a grease, and you apply that O-ring back in. It has a little seat in there. You may not be able to see it, but there's a seat in there that you actually place that right back in there, and it will seat right in there nicely. Now the same thing over here. You do the same thing with this one. Now these are foolproof. You can't mix these up. So here's your new basket. It comes in your kit. It's all put together like that. You can't put this in but only one way. And so this one here, if I try to put it in here, it wouldn't work. You couldn't put it together. It has to go in this way because the tip, the black tip, goes down inside. So you put that in, it goes down inside, and it seats way down in there. This one here goes in the other way. This here goes black facing up. Now the way you know that it's right, because when you go to put this part back on, see how this long part here goes into the deep chamber, and this one goes around that one, so you can't put it in this way. It won't allow you to. So you turn it around and you end up putting it this way. But before you do that, you have two more O-rings on this side, right here. So you take those off, and you can't mix them up because there's only exactly what you need. There's going to be two for each head. So you take these off, make sure it's clean. You take your gel, you put it on top, roll them back on. Do it to this side as well. You take your head, make sure that's seated down there nicely. And I drop the other one here. And then you take your, apply it down over onto there, and then you can tighten your head. So that part is basically done. You have these O-rings as well. So you can take these O-rings out, make sure they're clean with steel wool, take some of your gel, put that on, and apply your gels in there. I recommend pushing in your O-rings and then putting your gel on top. If you put the gel on these particular ones first, they have a tendency of popping back out. You don't want them pop out when you're putting it back together. So I usually take these O-rings, push them in, and then take the gel and put them on top. We've completed the end with the valves and that we call the baskets. We're going to focus on now this part, which is the diaphragm. This is a very, very important part. To remove this, you end up using, again, you can either using your gun of your experience with a 19mm socket, or if it's the first time, I highly recommend using your torque wrench. Loosen the bolt, take it off, and it's very short and small. So you take it off, and this is what it looks like. This piece here is more of an advanced
I'm not sure I understand.
replacement. So you don't need to replace that. Now this diaphragm is replaceable. Now what we do with this diaphragm is you have to check it to see if there's any cracks in it. It could be dried out, there could be cake product on it. It even could be frozen. It has all kinds of cracks in it. So from experience, you should be able to look at that and help diagnose for the future if you want to maintain the life of your pump. The life of the pump should be, they say UDORs, but 25 years if you maintain it properly. And this is one of the critical parts of maintenance, is learning what you're doing, not just doing it. Is learning what caused this. Was it lack of oil? Didn't change the oil? It sat for a long period of time? These parts are not cheap, and it's helpful to at least do a partial diagnosis. So what you do is you take your diaphragm, and then you take your new one, you sit it right in top, just like that. It seats in there nice and good. And then you can take your bolt, sit it in there, and tighten it. Now, when you tighten these bolts, it's very, very important that with every one of your engines, you should have a diagram and a spec sheet.
I'm not sure I understand.
That you need to use this as a reference because the torque specs will have it on here of what your wrench should be. Like for instance, this is 25 psi. pounds per square inch. So when you go to tighten that, it's required that when you go to tighten it, you're not tightening it too much, but you have a torque wrench to be able to tighten it. When you get to a certain point, you will hear it click and it will stop. So that's very critical. Now the same thing on these bolts here on that chart, which you should have with your pump, it will tell you that this spec is 32 pounds per inch. So when you go to tighten this, it will, when you set this at 32 here, as you're going, it will click when you get to 32. So that's a very critical part of that. So once you get this diaphragm in and this bolt tightened down, you're done basically with this part. I would just check the perimeter, make sure there's no bulky material, there's nothing impeding this being put back on. And you take your head with the part that you already built, you lay it back on, make sure your O-rings don't fall out, place it back on, you take your bolts, drop them in, take your ratchet, your proper socket, tighten them down, and again, these are 32 pounds per square inch. You go to tighten them, you're done. All you do is turn your pump around, and you turn it. That's why it's important to drain your oil. Then you can turn and prop it on your side with something. I usually use this here. Then take your socket and your wrench, and you take that off, and you do it all over again. So the process is duplicating everything that you would have done on the other side, and you do it 3 times. Now it is critical. These legs here is to help understand what direction things go. And I would recommend taking a marker and marking on the leg an A, and this is A, because these legs are tricky when you go to put them back on, of what direction they go in, so you can bolt it to the floor. That is probably the most confusing part towards the end. So once you get all 3 heads back on, they're all nice and tightened, now it's time to put the fluid back in. So make sure your nut on the bottom is tight, and then you start adding your oil in. The best way to do it is you apply your oil. Now this is 32 ounces, your typical containers are 28, so you need a little bit, about 2.5. As you pour it in until this fills up, wait a few minutes, let it drain down, fill it back up, and you'll know when you're done. One, you keep track, this is 28, and you add the other. Or when this stops, you'll know when it stops draining. You don't want to go any higher than this line. So that's roughly 32 ounces. So once you get that done, you take your cap, you put it on, and you're good. Now coming to your gearbox, is basically the same thing. When you take your nut off, you take this side nut off as well. And when you go to fill it, you're going to put 16 ounces in here. Is you take this nut off, and you put it in. It goes in very slow. Don't be impatient, because it goes down into a corrugated type of cylinder in there, and it takes a long time to get to the bottom. So what you do is you take this screw off and keep it open, and you patiently put it in. You wait a little bit, let it all settle down a little bit more, and eventually you're going to start seeing oil drip out this bleed hole. If you put too much in, the worst case scenario is that oil is going to keep coming out until it stops, and you just have to retain that. And then once it reaches halfway point, you're good, and then take your nut and put your nut back on. You should be good to go as far as completion of the basic rebuild of this pump. There's some more advanced, I'll touch, like basically on some of the more advanced ones, when you get to other levels, if you have leakage, one of the key things is when this oil is milky and it's different color than you're used to, it usually gets white, milky, depending on the product you're using. It's a clearly sign that you're getting mixture of your oil and your product is crossing. So one of the things you can do is that there's a ring in here with a spring that needs to be replaced. But to do that, you need to remove this whole pump, which is this gearbox, which is another whole process and another video for you in the future. But it's a clear indication is, again, it's one of the biggest things you get all milky and it's all discolored, is because one of these O-rings here and there's one on the back side that dry out, they get worn, and they need to be replaced. That's more of an advanced process, but that you'll see that on one of my other videos. So at this point, I think we're good. Now at the very end, forgive me here, is the Schrader valve. Now that it's all put back together, everything's torqued the way it needs to be, all the fluid's back in it, you take your compressor, you put it on the end here and you fill it up to be 120 psi. Most compressors don't go higher than what is needed, but in this case that would be fine, 120, 115 psi, and then put your Schrader valve back on, and you should be good to go. I would be very careful when you go to put this back on, and when you take it off, that your shaft that's coming from your engine doesn't bump up against this O-ring here, because it will knock out the spring in there and damage that bushing. So take your time and slide that in very slowly, and your gear from your engine will go right into where it needs to be, and you should be good to go to bolt it to the engine. If you have any other further questions after this is done, and you can always give us a call at Green Pro Solutions, and we can help talk you through it. Thank you for joining us for another episode of How It Works by Green Pro Solutions.